Today I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done into Paleolithic cannibalism. And really my interest was sparked around whether this might be something that's nutritionally driven or something that might have sort of more broader socio-cultural kind of motivations behind it. Just go over what the sort of talk outline will be. What I'm going to do is sort of situate us broadly in time where we are and which hominin species I've looked at. Then I'll sort of go over what the definitions of cannibalism are, how traditionally archaeologists have been able to tell whether cannibalism has occurred within the record, and how episodes of those cannibalism events have then been traditionally interpreted from those excavation records. And then that's sort of the first half of the talk, and in the second half I'll try and place this cannibalistic behaviour in different hominin species in a broader behavioural context, to see if that also helps sort of shed a bit of light around motivation and behavioural complexity within different human groups. And then we'll sort of come to some perhaps preliminary conclusions and things towards the end. So in terms of where we are in time, if we think about the 7 million years of human evolution, really where we're focusing is this last kind of million years in terms of archaeological evidence for cannibalism. So that's sort of cut marks on fossils and that sort of thing, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I'm pretty sure, given that most mammals practice cannibalism of one form or another, and so do insects and animal life, this must be a behavior that is deeply embedded in our evolutionary history. And I think the key question that's interesting is, when does this behavior become cultural versus just kind of an alternative food supply? When does it have more meaning behind it that is beyond a biological driver? And some of that will be in terms of how we define what cannibalism is. So at a very basic level, cannibalism is, or a cannibal is, a person or animal that eats any type of tissue of another individual of its own kind. So that's at its very broadest definition. But the word cannibalism itself describes a range of behaviors and tensions across a number of human species as well as animal species. But for us, and in humans, in modern humans, kind of say today in 2020, it comes down to about 7 different categories. You have nutritional necessity, or sometimes survival cannibalism. So that's where you have, plane crashes or a shipwrecks or something, and people consume the dead as a way to survive when there is no other food source available to them. But you also then have psychotic or criminal cannibalism, and depending on what generation you are, that might either be best represented by this Hannibal Lecter or this Hannibal Lecter, depending on whether you're a film or a TV buff, I guess. But psychotic or criminal cannibalism is where people engage in this act for criminal or psychotic motivations. But of course, this is a very complex behavior. It's also linked to aggressive or warfare cannibalism, where perhaps members from different groups might eat other members from other groups as a way of intimidation, or even as a way of honoring the dead in terms of taking on the bravery displayed by those individuals in battle. And equally, there are more complex issues around whether it's what's called endocannibalism, so in-group cannibalism, versus exocannibalism, which is out-group cannibalism. But it's also linked to spiritual or ritual practices. So, the Aztecs are well known for sacrificing individuals to appease the gods and then eating parts of those body. But it's also, fairly prevalent today in many world religions. I can think of in Christianity, for example, metaphoric cannibalism occurs pretty much on a weekly basis when people engage in the Eucharist. And for Catholics especially, imbibing that wafer and drinking that wine, for a Catholic, that really does become the body and the blood of Christ. So for me, this is that's a very powerful metaphoric cannibalism that is linked to spiritual and ritual practice. There's also gastronomic or dietary cannibalism, and this is where cannibalism is really just part of the dietary spectrum. So individuals of a group are eaten as another source of food. it's not necessarily something that's eaten regularly. It might just be when a member of the group dies, or a member from an outside group crosses your territory and you attack them. But you eat them, you treat them as another animal effectively, without kind of any specific social or cultural motivation behind it, like those described above. And there's also medicinal cannibalism. So this was fairly prevalent in the West, even into the Victorian period, where people would eat parts of dead bodies as cures for various ailments and diseases. So, in modern humans, we've got this whole range of motivations assigned to this act of cannibalism. How then do we access or assign these kind of motivational states to prehistoric archaeological examples, which is my particular interest, and particularly within this kind of the deep time of human evolution, because we'll be so far removed from those acts. And I think in order to answer that, we need to kind of have a look a little bit now at what the evidence for cannibalism is within the archaeological record, and how that is then kind of taken to interpret. So by looking at skeletal remains, there are about 13 signatures that have been identified that may indicate cannibalism. I think it's probably worth noting that it's not any single one of these signatures that indicates cannibalism necessarily, but more a combination of these signatures. So some of it, for example, might be the lack of a cranial base, which is where the base of the skull is cracked open, and where the spinal column joins, and that's kind of pulled out so that you can access the brain and that kind of thing. There might be a virtual absence of vertebra due to crushing or boiling if cooking is involved. More traditionally, there are cut and chop marks, which you can see on skeletal remains. So that's where the stone tool has left a mark on the bone after it's been kind of processing the skeletal remain. But also it's the arrangement of those cut marks. So it's their position, their number and placement on the skeleton, which might give an indication as to whether this is a butchery act, or whether it's maybe a kind of an excarnation act where you're actually cleaning the skeleton of flesh so that you can prepare it for secondary burial rather than for consumption. So it's not just the presence of cut and chop marks, it's where they're located and how that distribution works across the skeleton. Long bone breakage, I think, is probably one of the clearest evidences for cannibalism, because you're breaking those long bones, your arms, your legs, to get to the marrow that's inside. But there might also be things like anvil abrasions, where you use a rock underneath as you crack open things. Whether the butchery techniques, the processing of the hominin or human carcass is comparable to the butchery techniques that you see on faunal remains, and how those remains are treated after they have been consumed. Are they treated separately to faunal remains? So are they buried and treated reverentially in some way perhaps, or differently? Or are they treated as other animal remains and just thrown in the kind of the bone heaps? Along with the horse remains or something like that. So how is the post-processing discard treated? Is there evidence for burning on human bone? Peeling and percussion pits as just sort of part of the treatment process when you're processing carcasses. Are there scraping marks as opposed to cut marks? Scraping marks are where you're cleaning the flesh off the bone. That might indicate perhaps more preparation of the body for secondary reburial rather than consumption, but you can't rule consumption out necessarily. And more recently, there's been much more recognition that you can actually see hominin tooth marks on human bone. So that would be evidence of gnawing. That's probably a fairly direct evidence for cannibalism. And we can see that in this image here. So the sites that I've kind of looked at in my 2017 paper, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, are focused in the Paleolithic and tend to be more European focused. I'd really love to know if there are any examples like this elsewhere. I'm not aware of it, but that certainly doesn't mean that they don't exist. I'm sure they must do. So it would be really fascinating to talk to anybody afterwards if they have any knowledge. It would be very interested to know. but certainly from the European Paleolithic record, and I really did focus on the Paleolithic rather than going into the more recent prehistoric periods, because the motivations there become more complex in terms of into the Bronze Age and the Neolithic. Whereas it's the Paleolithic that sort of holds my interest the most. But here, sort of the most well-stratified sites, so the ones that have the most confident dates, really, and importantly for the purpose of this study, links to faunal remains in the same layers. I tend to try and focus on the ones that were the most securely kind of provenanced. So we have Grandolina in Spain, which is Homo antecessor from about 936,000 years ago. The Cuney de Largo from France, which is Homo erectus ? That's from the published reports about whether it's a Homo erectus. I'm not sure if it is or not, but that's certainly sort of reporting in this chart the excavator's designation. They say, so that's from about 680,000 years ago. Mulagursi, which is a Neanderthal site, from about 100 to 120,000. Alcedron in Spain at about 48,000. Pedreles, also in Spain, around 45. Zafaria, about 42,000. The Troisième cavern of Goyet in Belgium at about 40 to 45. Mazjuk Cave, which is a Polish site, from about 14 to 15,000 years ago, and Goss Cave in the UK. So there's a time range here, so hopefully we'll be able to see changes in behavior through time if that should exist. There's also a species change. What's interesting for me, certainly when I started this research many years ago as an undergraduate initially, and then through my master's, was that the composition of the people being eaten, it wasn't just adults, but it always seems to be a mixture of adults, adolescents, and into children. So it's young and old being consumed within these acts in various numbers. All of these sites also have faunal remains, butchered faunal remains, which are directly associated with the levels of the hominin. And if we have a look at the interpretation of these events, you'll see that they are mostly labeled as nutritional cannibalism events. And the nutritional cannibalism event in this respect really relates to dietary cannibalism. So they interpret these events as just being part of the dietary spectrum. Where you have ritual cannibalism, so unusually up here at De Largo and at Goss Cave, that ritual element is associated with what's seen to be an extra special treatment of the cranial material. Now, at Goss Cave, this is very well studied by Silvia Bello, who's done fantastic work at demonstrating how much treatment the Goss Cave skulls have undergone. And her interpretation is that at Goss Cave, you have a ritual element of the skull, and then a sort of a consumptive element to the postcranial material. Although, very interestingly, she has discovered some sort of engraved zigzag marks on, I think it's a piece of arm, which might mean that that two-tone definition would change for Goss Cave. There may be some more ritual treatment to the postcranial material than we currently know. The ritual cannibalism here in this early site at De Largo is also around interpreted unusual treatments around the crania, but I think it's very it's not well studied or published, so that's why I've included the question mark there. And Mazjuk Cave is seen to be an example of warfare cannibalism, where effectively this population, these 5 adults, 3 juveniles and 8 infants who were occupying a cave, seem to have been decapitated. So it's interpreted as a hostile group coming in to effectively take the cave over from the occupants there. Okay, so hopefully that kind of gives you a background to the sites that I was interested in, and sort of the excavators' interpretations around them. I'm just going to slightly pivot now to sort of try and explain why I was interested in perhaps understanding the calorie value of these events. And that's because I thought it would be a useful thing to do would be to understand what the calorific value of a cannibalistic event was in comparison to other animals that we knew were eaten and consumed by those groups. And this may allow us to think about these deep time cannibalism acts in a way that is not perhaps limited to just this ritual versus nutritional or dietary cannibalism debate, because I think it's more nuanced than that, was my gut feeling. So as you've seen, for many of these studies into kind of prehistoric cannibalism, we've got the majority being interpreted as nutritional cannibalism. But I found that kind of term nutritional cannibalism rather ambiguous. What does that actually mean? It doesn't really clarify whether these acts of cannibalism were truly important from a gastronomic sense, or more a result of kind of social structures within those hominid societies. So by examining these cannibalistic events from the kind of a calorie perspective in relation to the game that was hunted and consumed by those groups, I'd hope to kind of see if that might be able to tease out some of the nuance there that may exist. And that then led to this kind of my attempt to quantify cannibalism from that nutritional calorific perspective in this paper here in Scientific Reports. The methodology was fairly simple in many ways, and just hasten to add that there was no practical fieldwork or elements undertaken in this research. It's all from published sources, but there are a number of limitations. So what I did was I looked at published chemical compositions of the human body, mostly from the 1950s, 40s, and 50s, and the largest sample that I could find that kind of gave data in a clear and consistent format to allow comparison was for 4 adult males. So clearly sample size is very small, and clearly this doesn't include sex. So, and you will see from those charts that there are adults, children, adolescents and children consumed. It doesn't include adolescents and children in that original, these original chemical composition papers. But there's also males and females that have been consumed there too. So, but those limitations aside, I think it kind of gives a useful heuristic in order to kind of get a vague, sort of at least an overarching idea of what the calorie value of a human body might be. And the calorie conversion itself was fairly basic. It was a simple ratio conversion. So 1 gram of protein has about 4 calories, and 1 gram of fat has about 9 calories. And from the chemical composition data, they gave body parts broken down into different chemical components, including protein and fat. So you could sort of tease out the protein and fat data for each body part, convert those into calories, and that would then produce a model that kind of looks something like this. The limitation here is that it wasn't as, because I didn't undertake any kind of practical analysis in any way myself, it's perhaps not as refined as would be useful from an archaeological perspective. So for example, the head and the torso are combined under one sort of grouped value, and it wasn't really possible to kind of tease out the value of the brain from the spinal cord and the nerve endings that found there. So there's some lumping of the data, but this was as nuanced as I could kind of get it with the data that was available to me. And I kind of produced an image like this, breaking it down by body part where possible. So the points that have an asterisk are parts of the human body that you could reasonably assume to be consumed based on ethnographic data and archaeological sources. So it's just sort of trying to highlight here that not, when we're dealing with prehistoric cannibalism, not every part of the body was eaten. I mean, no one's eating the teeth, for example, and probably not the spleen, I'd have thought. But generally from ethnographic and archaeological data, bits like the skeleton's broken up to get the marrow, the skin's eaten, adipose tissue, liver, and so on. In order to try and make this kind of data relevant to the archaeological record, I then tried to scale some of these values to different age ranges to take into account the adolescence, the juvenile, the child, and the infant representations in the Paleolithic record. And this was done really using growth charts. At the time of this research, we just had my firstborn. Got 2 little boys. One's just sort of 2.5, but he was about 6 months or so, or just coming up to 6 months, I think. I can't quite remember. Don't tell him. But I was looking at these growth charts and kind of thinking about cannibalism and calories. My wife did get a little bit nervous as to why I was looking at growth charts and calories, but I did assure her it was just for this research purpose and nothing more than that. But the point here is to sort of try and scale it to try and get as accurate representation of the archaeological record as possible, with all the limitations around the data set fully acknowledged. I just sort of, to take a slight pause from the data-driven elements of the talk at the moment, I just kind of wanted to show you that, when this paper was published, it got quite a lot of media attention. And it's sort of a side interest of mine is also how the media like to change and sensationalize, particularly archaeological discoveries. And so I'm just going to show you a couple of kind of images that were produced in the more sort of the popular science media. So this one was one that's produced. That's fine. It's kind of largely based on my own diagrams. That's okay. This one's okay too. It's a bit clunky perhaps, but it's got all the main parts there, the different parts of the body, and the values associated with it. Some of them are really good. So here's a silhouette with these kind of anatomically detailed parts of the body and showing the calorie values from my table. Like this one, I think, is also another sort of a good one. So sometimes, that media exposure is not a bad thing. They actually sometimes help visualize things in a different way, and it can be quite good. But sometimes it does also sort of go a bit wrong. Here's another sort of reasonable attempt. Here's probably one of the worst ones, though, where I can't remember which publication it was, but it was just sort of 81,500 calories of meaty goodness, a sad face and sort of a heart shape. It's a very strange interpretation of my work. And this was probably the most interesting read, if anyone is interested. Here's how many humans you would need to hunt to survive the apocalypse. And it's a story about someone who needs to sort of kill their neighbor repeatedly. It's just an odd way in that how, and hopefully you will see from the end of this talk that actually my study, cannibalism is a part there, but actually what I was trying to get through is about the complexity of human behavior in the past, and how going from that as my main message to some of these things is sort of something we all have to be wary of, I think, when we're aware of when we publish our work. Okay, back to the kind of perhaps the more interesting things. Looking at the human values, so what I decided to then do was just really compare just the muscle weights, taking on board that the fat values will give us more calories, but what sort of what data that we had access to and estimates that had been done before in relation to Pleistocene fauna tended to be around the protein and the muscle weights. So I've compared here the muscle weights of Homo sapiens from my study at the top to all of these Pleistocene fauna, and all of these Pleistocene fauna were found at the archaeological sites in the same layers as the modified human remains, although not all animals are represented at all sites. If that makes sense. The ones highlighted in green represent the silhouettes of animals, just for ease of interpretation, and the yellow are the animals that are the same level or below the value gotten from the human remains. And I think what you can tell from this table is that actually most of the fauna that was hunted and consumed produces an awful lot more calories per individual than a human does. So a mammoth is 3,600,000, a bear 600,000 calories, boar 324,000 calories. A single individual produces a huge number of calories. We're really just looking at our muscle value, only coming in at about 32,000, which is the same, just slightly higher than a saiga, and then roe deer, beaver. These very small animals come in below us. So we don't rank. We're not highly nutritious from a calorie perspective, but in many respects that actually makes perfect sense. We're not a big animal. We aren't a large animal. We're not a cow or a deer or a horse or anything like that. We're actually quite a small animal in terms of average body weight, 65 kgs or so. So one thing that sort of came through the study is sometimes you would anecdotally hear that humans were nutritious and the brain's particularly calorie rich and so on. Okay, but it's a matter of perspective and scale. Compared to these other animals that were being consumed, we aren't. We're a small animal in that ecological context. And we kind of fall here right where you would expect us to for an animal of our size. If we start to look at then the archaeological values, so these are the total site values from the archaeological record up here in blue, and sort of what I've done here in these columns is given the total skeletal calorie value and then the number of days at a group of 25 as an average of modern human adult males. So that's people today needing 2,400 calories would need how long this episode of cannibalism would sustain you for. A number of days. A group of 25 Neanderthal males would survive, so they need estimated to have a higher calorie intake per day at 4,000, and then the number of days that a Pleistocene anatomically modern human could survive with a higher calorie intake of about 3,700 a day. So I thought this would just be a useful way to kind of try and understand, how much sustenance can you extract from episodes of cannibalism rather than a single individual hominin. Which you can see here, sorry. And really, in terms of the number of days, Delago is big because there's a large number of people involved. But actually, for most of these episodes, it's not a huge number of days in a modern sense, and less as you look at these Pleistocene values. Really, it's a day, maybe two at the most on average. So a single individual of mammoth, woolly rhino, auroch, bison, cow or bear gives you more total calories and allows that group of 25 to survive for more days than this entire sort of cannibalism episode from any of these sites. And that's on the assumption that all of the individuals were consumed at the same time at these sites. And the time depth is too coarse to get that kind of resolution. They may well have been consumed over time, maybe tens of years, hundreds of years, thousands of years, days, months, we don't know. But if you assume that they were eaten in one go, it's not a particularly nutritious or calorie-rich meal. So these green animals give us more calories than these entire events do as a single individual. The yellow ones, so horse, giant deer, red deer, muskox, boar, and deer, give around about the same value of calories as the entire, these are single individuals again, versus the entire cannibalism episode from these sites. The yellow ones are, so these are sort of within the range, but generally tend to be more. The yellow ones come in around the same range as as a single individual would do. And then, oops, sorry, if I can go back. I'm not sure I can go back. Yeah. And then the white ones at the bottom all return less calories per individual than those events. So when you start to look at it, scale up and look at them as perhaps events that occur, there is still, for me, a huge range of faunal material here that produces more calories as a single individual than a group. And that's certainly kind of what I was trying to get at with this slide here. So, 6 individuals, significantly less calories than one mammoth, woolly rhino, or bear. About the 6 individuals, same number of calories as a megalosaurus, a yak, or a boar. And I think, this, when you start to think about the motivations around these things, what I sort of tried to kind of argue in my paper, because the reviewers came back and said, yes, but they could be eaten for meat's sake. And humans are less dangerous to hunt than this kind of big game. And okay, that might be true, but I still think, that a group of hominins, they're still the same kind of species as you. They can think the same way that you do. They can run like you can. They can fight like you can. We're not vulnerable game in that respect. And I just kind of, for me, I just kind of feel that there is more, there's more to be gained from the hunting and killing of a single faunal remain than there is perhaps from going after a whole group of people. And this is where I think we need to start looking at the motivations for cannibalism or Paleolithic cannibalism in a bit of a broader context. So even in ancient modern human populations, so that's Homo sapiens, there are a whole host of reasons for cannibalism that stretch from dietary or nutritional to aggressive and ritual. And we can see some of these kind of key papers here: the ritual cannibalism from Goth's Cave, the warfare cannibalism from Mazgic Cave, and so on. But even in our kind of closest existing primate relatives today, we can see that there are varied motivations for cannibalism. So there are, intra-group aggression is recorded in West African chimpanzees, where, kind of a former alpha male was killed and then members of the group kind of ate parts of their body. And in cases of maternal cannibalism in wild bonobos from 2 different field sites in the Congo. So, it's not like, even in wild animals, in terms of primates and things, the motivations for cannibalism there are varied and complex. So, it just doesn't make sense to me to try and break down Paleolithic or prehistoric cannibalism into this dichotomy of ritual versus nutrition. And that's where we need to kind of get a broader perspective on complexity and behavioral complexity within our kind of human ancestors. So the kind of second half of this talk, I'm going to sort of focus on some more recent advances in knowledge that we've had just in the last 10 years or so surrounding not just Neanderthals and Denisovans, but also hopefully some sort of a Homo antecessor, and try and see within this broader context of recognized behavioral complexity where cannibalism might fit. Now, it's very problematic, but often when we start to talk about behavioral complexity, these are linked back to definitions of modern human behavioral complexity, which is often best summarized by McBreety and Brooks's really iconic and famous image around this kind of this gradual approach of behavioral complexity in modern humans. But from a cognitive perspective and a behavioral complexity perspective, it's the things that modern humans were thought to do in isolation that other species didn't. So that's producing things like cave art, portable art, decorating themselves, either through ochre colorings, producing jewelry, beads, and that kind of thing. And often these are seen as the kind of the benchmark then for clear, complex language systems and complex belief systems that sort of dominated the behavioral complexity narrative. And the reason being is that for a very long time, these sorts of behaviors were not recognized in other human species. Well, as I'm sure you're all aware, a lot has happened in the last 10 years to kind of gradually change this picture. So we know now that Neanderthals are using red ochre from about 200 to 250,000 years ago. That's about the same time range as Homo sapiens are using ochre in Africa from about 300,000 years ago. There's not a huge difference in terms of deep time around the use of ochre. We don't know what the ochre is used for, admittedly, but ethnographically, certainly the evidence seems that when ochre is used, it's often used for a kind of a visual display behavior initially, and then the other benefits like used as in mastics or as a medicine for calming stomachs and things like that. Those are recognized secondary benefits as they become more familiar with the substance. But Neanderthals are using ochre for at least as long as modern humans are. There's also now the sort of recognized structure of space within Neanderthal societies. This is the oldest, dated to 179,000 years ago from Bruniquel Cave in southwestern France. This is the cave entrance, which they believe is a similar or the same entrance as would have been present 179,000 years ago. This is where these structures are located. This is about a 300-meter movement inside the cave. Now, if any of you are familiar with caves, you tend to have a daylight zone around cave entrances that really extends at best into the tens of meters into the cave.